So thank you. And I think we'll just begin. We only have 40 minutes. I'm speaking about beauty, but the question of what is beauty. I hope everybody can hear me. Give me some sign if that isn't the case.
Yes, David, we can.
Okay. So I think it's pretty obvious that we're not going to be able to produce a universal theory of beauty in the next 40 minutes, but it might be possible, I think, for us to, let us say, emancipate ourselves from some of the regnant conventional views, which are still very prevalent, both in the West and also in India, where I think they're largely a colonial legacy. And the way to do that is not, I think, by trying to explore some pre-existing theory, whether from South Asia or elsewhere, but rather to try to extrapolate on the basis of our own experience. In other words, a kind of empirical and inductive method. And that means we have to try a few things. I'm going to be playing some South Indian Carnatic kritis for you. And if there's time at the end, we'll look at a painting. But I want to begin, I should say, by the way, I have a kind of hypothesis. It's a very simple, rudimentary one. I'll share it with you in a few minutes. But I want to begin with a verse from the classical period. It's a Kalidasa verse, which I have a feeling that many of you will know. Many of you will know it by heart. It's one of the most famous verses in Sanskrit literature. It comes from the introduction to the 5th act of the Shakuntala, and it's about beauty, and not in a kind of theoretical way so much as something that Kalidasa himself seems to have formulated on the basis of something he knew in himself. So it's a famous verse. I'll just recite it, translate it, and then say a few things about it as a way of beginning. It's a kind of point of departure. So the verse is Ramyani Viksha Madhuransha Nishamya Shabdan Pariyutsuki Bhavati Yat Sukitopi Jantuhu Tat Chetasas Marati Nunam Abodha Purvam Bhavastirani Janenantara Sauhridani. So actually the context matters a bit. This is a verse which is the prelude to a devastating cognitive disaster that is about to unfold in Act 5 of the Shakuntala, when Dushyanta is looking straight at Shakuntala and doesn't recognize her or remember her. But the actual trigger is that before Shakuntala arrives at the court, he hears some beautiful song being sung somewhere in the palace. And so he says this verse, and what it means, just a simple translation, it means seeing something lovely, hearing sweet sounds. Even a happy person is filled with longing. We could also say, even a happy person becomes restless. Pariyutsuki bhavati. That's the thesis of the verse. And then the second half offers an explanation for this slightly surprising, baffling feeling of longing. This is Dushyanta speaking. He said that must be, he says, that must be because the mind remembers what was long unknown, loves from other lifetimes, still firm with feeling, or still alive with feeling, we might say. So just want you to notice this verse. I mean, you probably heard it before many times. But look what Kalidasa says to us. He says that if you hear something beautiful, if you see some very beautiful sight, it does not produce normally a feeling of profound serenity, but just the opposite. It has a kind of disturbing, troubling, unsettling, maybe even slightly uncanny effect. And you know, that's true, at least to my own experience. I don't know if it's true for you, but I can tell you on my own experience, that's a very normal thing for me. If I go to the opera, I love opera. If I go to the opera, I hear, let's say, Così fan tutte, pretty soon, as they begin to sing, I begin to feel this kind of unease and a kind of longing, some kind of desire that is not focused on something specific, but that comes with other things, like a little bit of anxiety. I don't want this to end. Something I know from my own experience. I think it's a true perception. And not only for me, I assume. So you'll notice that the verse, the Kalidasa verse, has two symmetrical halves. That's actually worth noticing. It's a classical verse, and it's symmetrical in the sense that we have two lines, two padas at the beginning setting out the empirical observation about longing, and then we have the two lines that give some kind of explanation for it. This is Dushyanta speaking to himself. So he says, why is that? Why is there this longing? It's because, he says, we have in our mind all kinds of memories, vasana memories, unconscious memories, abodha purvam. And these memories are still alive. They're still full of feeling. And something about the artistic moment, the experience of beauty. Notice that this is not about beauty itself. It's about the experience of beauty. So something in that experience of beauty, Dushyanta says, actually is maybe Kalidasa telling us, has to do with the unconscious residues of the mind, which are reactivated when one sees something beautiful. I don't know how you feel about that. My own feeling is that the second half of the verse is infinitely less powerful and convincing than the opening statement. And that in itself may be something worth thinking about. I want to say one or two words about the way this verse has developed in the tradition. We're not going to be talking very much today about the classical period or even the high medieval period, but I want to say at least a few words about how Abhinavagupta, some 600 years after Kalidasa, how he understands this verse. He brings it in his commentary on the Natya Shastra, the Abhinava Bharati, and he says a very interesting thing. He tries to define what it is that constitutes that pariyutsukatva, that longing, that restlessness that some artistic experience can trigger. And he says, actually he says it in the commentary in the Abhinava Bharati. He also says it in the commentary that he has on the Ishvara Pratyabhignya Vivriti Vimarshini. He says that this is something which has what he calls akarakam abhilasha matram. It has a non-objectified desire. It's a desire which is an objectless desire. It's a desire for something that we don't know and cannot easily define. And then he goes on to say another really important thing about it. First of all, he says this desire, it is, he says, bhunjana rupata. Its form or its very nature is of enjoyment. It's a kind of bhoga. That's important actually when we're talking about beauty, because the Indian aesthetic tradition has never been ashamed to say that enjoyment, pleasure, is the obvious goal for the experience of beauty. It's not always the case in other traditions. So it's a kind of experience of pleasure, or the longing for pleasure, which is not tied to a particular object. And that for Abhinavagupta means that actually it involves a kind of turning away from the experience which might be available to us of our own tremendous fullness and richness. That's the problem with icha, with desire. You know, there's another interesting thing about this sentence of Abhinavagupta's, which is that the idea of an objectless cognition, you know, that's a possible definition of what is normally called Brahmananda, the kind of ultimate fullness of awareness. It also has no object. You can think about that a little bit if you like. There's some more things I could say about this notion of Abhinavagupta's, I'll just say one more thing, which is important. And some of you, I imagine you may know this actually. There's a really important statement that comes in the same context. In the Abhinavabhalati, Abhinavagupta says, what happens to a spectator in the theater, first of all, he's looking at something very remarkable on stage, but he knows it's a fiction. It's more or less of a commonplace in the Kashmiri Alankara Shastra since the time of Sri Shankuka that the drama, let us say, or the kavya, it's a fictional reality. And Abhinavagupta says, if you look at that fictional reality, after a while it may wear thin, you get tired of it. And when that happens, you no longer believe in it at all. You don't believe that the actor is real, and you don't believe that the part that he embodies is real, or she. But before that happens, if you're lucky, according to Abhinavagupta, you have a moment where two cognitive systems cancel each other out. One is the aesthetic universe, which has its own integrity and autonomy and a kind of particular promising potential for fullness, and offers the possibility that one might connect with a kind of deeper level of our existence. And the other system is the everyday system where there is space and there is time, and above all, there are causal sequences that we like to indulge in. And the fascinating thing is that Abhinavagupta tells us that these two systems, in the course of a spectator's watching of the drama, being immersed in the drama, they cancel one another out, and there's a kind of open space. They go away, and into that space, the rasa may begin to percolate. He also says another really important thing, which is that the spectator, says Abhinavagupta, he says a spectator, he is not completely absent from his own self as he watches. He is not what he calls atyanta tiraskrita. He's not annulled. He's still there in some residual form. But on the other hand, he is not ullikita. He's not entirely, how shall we say, defined or crystallized. He's in some kind of in-between state. And in that state, you have this act of canceling out these two cognitive systems. We have a very brilliant young Sanskrit student in Jerusalem. She's now doing her PhD. She wrote a wonderful MA thesis in which she claimed that, to put it in a very simple form, that as far as Abhinavagupta is concerned, and remember that this is partly in relation to that same verse of Kalidasa's with which we began, the experience of beauty, and maybe actually beauty itself, is a matter of some kind of cognitive dissonance. There's a kind of clash. What Abhinavagupta says is anyonya pratibandha balat. Because these two systems clash in the mind of the spectator, then, if you're lucky, you get beauty and the experience of beauty. Okay, so that, I'm going to leave you with that now, and we're going to move into a much later period, the early modern period. Early modern for me means from the 16th century and into South Indian sources. Mostly musical texts. So maybe I should begin by saying now, I'm going to play something for you in just a moment. Before you hear, this is going to be a kind of laboratory experiment. We'll see how this affects you. I'm going to play something for you in a minute, but here, let me just set out very simple terms, the thesis or the hypothesis that I think we should be checking. And that is that the so-called neoclassical idea of beauty, which is based on the notion of harmony and symmetry and balance, and which is meant to induce in the spectator or the listener or the reader some semblance of serenity, that neoclassical ideal does not seem to have much resonance or purchase in South Asian notions of beauty. And instead, I'm going to be arguing that in the South Indian materials, it's an empirical statement. We'll try it out together in just a moment. Beauty is dependent to some extent upon dissonance. I'm calling it dissonance. Could be disjunction, something jarring, some kind of perturbation. It's not such a simple statement as it might seem, because within the classical sources, also in Abhinavagupta, there is a notion of the spectator, the listener, reaching a kind of peacefulness, vishranti. Arindam Chakrabarti, who I think may be in the audience, has written a beautiful essay about it. I'm not going to come back to that now. In fact, I should say that the neoclassical ideal that I've just set out in a kind of very reduced form is in a way, it's a way somewhat unfair and distorted way to set it out, because if you were to read any of the classical sources, I would recommend, for example, Lessing's famous essay, Lao Koon. If you read any of it, you see it's a much more complex thing than just the existence of symmetry and balance and so on. Anyway, let's take this as the Purva Paksha, that is the neoclassical view, and I'm going to try to offer a new view, and we're going to do it in an inductive way. So let's begin. I'm going to begin with a South Indian raga, Carnatic raga, which is called Rasika Priya. It's also sometimes called Rasa Manjari. You know, there's a wonderful website. It's called Raga Surabhi. Some of you may know it. Gives you the scales, the Arohana and Avarohana scales, the rising and falling scales of any particular raga. And let's begin by playing the scales for this raga of Rasika Priya. It's a very short thing. It'll just take about a minute.
Sari ga ma pa da ni sa sa ni da pa ma ga ri sa Sari ga ma pa da ni sa sa ni da pa ma ga ri sa.
Okay, that's enough for this. And I'm going to play you a kirtan of Muthuswami Dikshita's in just a minute in that raga. But first, you know, if I could actually see you, which unfortunately I can't, I'm like talking into a void. But if I could see you, I would ask you if any of you felt that there is anything like some form of dissonance in the scale that you just heard, the rising and falling scale. And actually, if I was present to you in the same space, I would ask those of you who felt that there was such a kind of disturbance, I'd ask you to raise your hand. So I can't do that. And I don't know what the answer is. But let me put it like this. We have in South India, in the theory of Carnatic music, as we find it both in the musicological texts and in the oral tradition of teaching of the ustads, teachers, we have a very strong theory of what is called vivaditva, which we could translate as a kind of dissonance or disharmony or disjunction, vivaditva. So before I play you the composition of Dikshita, I want to just tell you the simplest thing that you can hear, and you see it in the sources, including very classical sources, about this notion of the vivadi note. Because the idea is that a raga may have, probably should have, a vivadi note. Now, I just want to begin by saying that I'm going to try to explain what that means without getting too far into the technical vocabulary, because that would take us some hours. But let me give you the analogy that these sources offered about the existence of this vivadi note, this discordant note. They say they're already in the Brihadeshi. It's also there in the Sangita Ratnakara, later text. They say that there are 4 kinds of notes in any raga scale. You have the vadi, that is to say, usually the tonic, that is the main note that gives some kind of basis and shape and form to the entire raga. That note is the king. It's a political metaphor. And then there's a samvadi, that is a note that is distinguished by its harmonious quality. And I say he, that samvadi note, it's like a person, that's like the minister, the amatya, the chief minister, the prime minister. And in this analogy, the idea is that the king and the prime minister are supposed to get along very nicely. Actually, it's not very true to reality, but in the analogy, that's how it works. So for example, if you have a scale which begins with sa, the vadi, I sing sa, re, ga, ma. You hear that ma, pa. If I go up to pa, both the ma and the pa are samvadi notes. This is a scientific thing which has to do with the frequencies of vibration and so on. Okay, so we have the vadi note and we have the samvadi note, which are in some kind of harmony or consonance. And then all of the rest of the audible notes are anuvadi notes. That is, they are the other ministers that kind of go along with the king. But the 4th element is the vivadi. And the vivadi is defined as a vinashaka. He kills the raga. He destroys the raga. He is the enemy. You know, already in the Arthashastra, you can say you cannot have a king who doesn't have an enemy. Without an enemy, no king is king. And it's a really fascinating thing that in the conceptual system that produced this idea of vivaditva, a discord or disjunction, a silent note maybe, or maybe it's an audible note. We'll see in just a moment. It's a fascinating thing that in this system, that vivadi note has an intrinsic and necessary part to play. Actually, it'd be possible to stop the lecture right here. I've sort of made the point I wanted to make, but I want to go ahead and let you hear some of this for yourselves. So let's now play the composition of Muthuswami Dikshita, one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest of the Carnatic composers. And this is a composition in this Rasika Priya Raga. It's called Shringara Rasa Manjari. We're not going to spend time at the moment on the text of the lyrics. I just want you to listen to a few minutes, maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes of the raga as it's sung by Amrita Murali. And again, I'm asking you to try to pay attention and see if you can identify some kind of vivadi note. I want you to trust your ears and your intuitions. You don't have to be learned in the musicological theory. Your ears are more than enough. It's an empirical thing. Okay, let's play a few minutes of the raga.
I just want to add in that some attendees did tell us when we played the Arohana and Avarohana that they did feel dissonance. So if others want to do it, then please use the chat box to do it. I'm playing the Kriti just.
Shringararasamanjarim Shri Kamakshim Gaurim Shritajana Kalpavallarim Chintayeham. शृङ्गाररसमञ्जरीं श्रीकामाक्षीं गौरीं श्रुतजनकल्पवल्लरीं चिन्तयेऽहम् शृङ्गाररसमञ्जरीं श्रीकामाक्षीं गौरीं श्रुतजनकल्पवल्लरीं चिन्तयेऽहम् अंगारकादि ग्रहदोष निवारण करी अंगारकादि ग्रहदोष निवारण करी अंगारकादि ग्रहदोष निवारण करी अनग कुसुमादि शक्ति प्रिय करी.
Okay. I'm sorry to have to cut into the performance. It's a kind of brutal act in its own right, but in the interest of time, I hope, and actually I assume, that all of you will have had some experience of this vivaditva. And if we were able to talk to one another, I would ask you, what are the notes where that vivaditva is most clearly felt? Where is it situated? So since I can't really ask you that, I'll tell you what I think. And I'll also tell you what the tradition would say. This is what's called a vivadi raga. Interestingly, in the Carnatic system, there are more vivadi ragas, that is, ragas that have this dissonant note in some prominent place. There are supposedly 40 of them, as opposed to 32, let's call them normal ragas. That strengthens the assumption that I was presenting earlier, that the vivadi has some kind of intrinsic role. So as I listen to this, this raga, what I hear is a certain kind of dissonance that is on the ma note. Those of you who know music were perhaps able to identify this. Also, that ma note is significant. It's what's called a swarakshara, because the ma falls on, the ma note falls on a word, manjari, a word that is actually begins with the same syllable ma. But what the tradition would tell us, if we were going to stick to a kind of normative, maybe slightly pedantic way of thinking about it, is that the true vivaditva is in the ri, the second note, sa ri, and in the dhaivata note, closer to the top of the scale. It's a chatur shruti dhaivata, that is to say, it's a raised dhaivata. And actually, I think that there is something to be said for what the tradition tells us here. It's probably right. Normally, if you hear a slightly higher version of the ri, what is sometimes called ri3, or similarly, a high dha note, dha3, that there's a high likelihood that that's going to be in some way vivadi. Now I'm going to explain why, and I'm going to have to do this, although it's a complicated thing. I'm going to do it in about a minute or so. There is a simple explanation, although this is not the last word, but let me just give you a taste of what the tradition says. The tradition will say, and we have it in Venkatamakin, the great codifier of the ragas in the Tanjavur court in the 17th century. What they say is that there are two kinds of notes in any raga scale. There are notes that are completely autonomous and independent, And they are notes that overlap with other notes. So in order to understand that, you have to know the difference between the swara notes, that is the audible notes of any particular raga scale, and the shruti intervals, which are the raw acoustic material which underlie and feed into the swaras in a somewhat complicated way. You know, in any raga, we're going to have 7 notes. And minimally, there will be, at least in potential, 12 shruti intervals, because these shrutis are distributed among the swara notes. So sa, the first note, has 4, and ri, the second note, has 3, and ga, the third note, has 2, and so on. That's how these things appear in the classical sources. But guess what? It's possible for some notes to borrow shrutis from a neighbor, either higher or lower in the scale. And if, for example, the second note, ri, like in the raga that you just heard, if the second note, ri, borrows 1 or 2 shrutis from its neighbor, ga, then that creates a kind of tension. Now, I could explain why that tension is there, but I don't want to go into the details any further. But what it means, among other things, is if you have a Ra 3, an elevated Ra, it's quite possible that, first of all, it's possible and likely that that will be classed not as Ra, but as a low Ga, Ga 1. And it's very likely that that note will be, as it is in this raga, a vivadi note. Okay, I want to reassure you and tell you that's the last technical thing I'm going to say. All the rest of it today is something that is really kind of a form of common sense or of one's own experience in listening to a raga. And we're going to move on to another raga. Another way to say what I've just said, and I think a way that is much closer to experience. I'm going to borrow a formula that I heard from Naresh Kirti, who was here with us in Jerusalem. What normally will set off a sense of dissonance is a sequence, a sonic sequence in which there are hardly any intervals at all, maybe no intervals. If I were to sing to you, sa, re, ga, should sound a little vivadi. And it's something that the ear naturally picks up. And it's something that you will be able to hear and note for yourself without knowing any theory of Carnatic music. You have to learn to depend upon your own experience. Okay, let's move on to another raga. So we have another 10 minutes. I'm going to play you is a 2-minute performance of a very beautiful, I think, very beautiful raga, which is hardly known and almost never performed. It's a raga which is called Shyamala in the Dikshitar system, or Shyamalangi in the Venkatamaki system. And I don't think you'll have any trouble identifying the vivadi notes. Just listen for them. If we had more time, I would take you through the scale. But you'll be able to do this on your own. And I should just tell you that this is a composition on the goddess Meenakshi in Madurai, who is called Shyamala, the dark goddess. And you might listen to the ma note when the text goes Shyamala, Shyamalangi, Matangi, Matangi. Let's hear it.
Shyamalangi Matangi, Shyamalangi Matangi, Namaste Shankari Saraswati, Vinote Shyamalangi Matangi, Namaste Shankari Saraswati.
I don't know what you think, but I think this is an exquisitely beautiful raga. And I think that one of the active components in the beauty that one hears is the fact that there are vivadi notes. They're particularly conspicuous. And if you want to try and expand the range of what I'm saying, then I recommend that you go to the Raga Surabhi site and listen to the scale of, let us say, Varali, which is a Vivadi Raga, or Nattai, another Vivadi Raga. And you can experiment with yourselves. Now, because time is getting short, I had hoped that we would have time to actually look at the text of a very unusual kirtana by Muthuswami Dikshita. Some of you may know it. It's the kirtana in the raga called Tarangini, Maye Tvam Yahi. It's an appeal to the goddess Maya to go away. Or actually, in a minute, he asks her to come back. We're not going to have time to look at this now. And I was also going to play you a little, like 2 or 3 minutes of the opening of the Mozart dissonance quartet, just so that you would see that this theory of dissonance and its, let us call it its structural or implicit role in the creation of beauty is not something located only in South Indian music or South Asian music, but also even at the very height of the neoclassical period in Vienna, we can see Mozart himself let us say, highlighting dissonance as the opening of his quartet. But since we don't have the time, I recommend that you listen to the opening bars of the Dissonance Quartet. You'll find them on YouTube. And I want to end by moving away from the music and showing you a painting. We look at the first of 2 paintings that I prepared, and I'll end with that. And then we can see if there's a discussion. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this painting. I hope all of you can see it. This comes from an illustrated manuscript of the Bhagavata Purana from Mysore, from the first half of the 19th century. It was produced under the aegis of a great connoisseur of painting called Mummadi Krishnaraja Vodayar. One of the most beautiful art books that I have ever seen has just appeared about a year and a half ago in India. It's a study and reproduction of the illustrations to this Bhagavata Purana from Mysore, written and edited by B.N. Goswami. There's a lot I could say about the particular artistic styles that we see in this manuscript. And although it's a 19th century, early 19th century production, it's very much continuous with the early modern period in painting in general in the South. But I want you just to look at this picture. Just look at it, let your eyes sink into it. This story is one which you probably know. You can see in the upper left Balarama, and he's holding on to the plow, his hala. And what he is doing is dragging the city of Hastinapura into the Yamuna River. And he's doing that because Samba, the son of Krishna and Jambavati, kidnapped the daughter of Duryodhana, who was called Lakshmana, at the time of her Swayamvara. And this very nearly precipitated early on the major war between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. And so Balarama stepped in trying to actually prevent the outbreak of war, but the Kauravas were so stubborn and nasty that he got fed up, and he actually carried off, he's very strong, he moved the city, dragged the entire city of Hastinapura into the river. So what you're seeing in this picture, and I hope you'll agree with me that it's a very unusual picture. You can see it spread over 2 folios. What you're seeing is that there's a piece of the city in the lower left, which has already fallen into the river. And the rest of the city is at an angle because it's being dragged away from where it's usually situated into the river. It's right before it falls in. by Balarama. But if you look at it, just look at that painting, you can see the kind of thing that I was trying to get at by the musical examples that I gave you. There's something which is very far from symmetrical or balanced or serene or harmonious. In fact, it's the total opposite of that. The picture itself is an exercise in asymmetry, in odd angles, in a kind of half upside down reflection and half angular vision of a city which is about to fall into the river. And in fact, if you look closely, even in the upper left part of the painting, you'll see that even there, things are not particularly balanced and harmonious. So this is just one example. You know what, Vignesh, you could show the other picture. I won't say anything about it, but just to give you a sense, this same manuscript, just look at it. You see how it's off center? It's a battle scene. I won't go into it, but I would say that in this Bhagavata Purana from Mysore, maybe half of the paintings, they're exquisite paintings, maybe half of them have effects that belong to this whole world of dissonance and disjuncture and uneasiness and perhaps a spookiness or something that unsettles the viewer. And that's because it would seem to be, if we were to extrapolate on the basis of even these very few examples, I could give many more, it seems to be the case that disjunction and dissonance are necessary. They are necessary triggers for an experience of beauty. That's in itself a kind of slightly simplified, even impoverished statement of something which needs to be filled out and amplified. And if there were time, I would love to recite for you a Telugu poem, for example, just so you would see how in any Telugu classical poem you have something of this same Vivadi experience. But I think for now I'd better stop and we'll see if there are questions that I can address.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. This is very illuminating. I think we'll begin the questions right away. The first question has to do with the musical pieces that you played for us. So it's true that these ragas have Vivadi notes in them, and therefore we can say that beauty has something to do with dissonance. But what about ragas in which there are no Vivadi notes? So how will we reconcile that? And the second, I think a version of this question is, in these very ragas, if I sing a note that is not in the scale, then my music teacher is going to say, that's dissonant, don't sing that. So yes. How do we reconcile these two notions?
All right, that's a wonderful question. I'm glad you asked it because it touches upon something which I'm going to say, although it's a little tentative. But you can hear, I have heard, from in the oral tradition of the Carnatic teachers, and also I have to confess that for several years I studied Drupad with a Hindustani teacher who's here in Jerusalem, so I have some experience of the same kind of question in the Hindustani tradition. Okay, so what you sometimes hear is the following. Vignesh, you're absolutely right, your music teacher will say, you made a mistake. You have to be careful. Because I know your teacher is in the audience, I just want to say very tentatively, there's a slight danger of what I sometimes call a kind of hypernormativity. And it's especially prominent in the Carnatic musical scene for historical reasons. I won't say any more about it, but there is such a thing. But what you can sometimes hear, listen to the following thing. Sometimes people say, I heard this from G.M. Krishna actually. Some people will say that the Vivadi note is a silent note. Let us call it a normal raga, not a Vivadi raga where you're going to be able to hear it for sure, but in a normal raga, there's also going to be a Vivadi because you cannot have any more than a king can exist without his enemy. You can't have a raga without the Vivadi, but that note will be silent. But that silent note will color the entire experience of the scale, if you know how to listen for it. Of course, not everybody will necessarily choose the same note. There are all kinds of issues here, but you have to imagine a situation where you might have a silent vivaldi note, which is present by virtue of its absence. And not only that, because it sometimes is the case, it's rare, but it's sometimes the case that a very great musician will actually sing a vivaldi note on purpose because of the aesthetic effect. I'm not saying it happens every time you go to a kacheri in Madras, but it sometimes happens, and it only will happen, obviously, if it's a singer who knows what he's doing and is prepared to take that kind of risk. And of course, he knows that he's very likely to meet the fierce disapproval of all kinds of people who are there in the sabha. You know, it's very likely the case, but they might do it. I've heard it once or twice. You might not always be able to identify it. On the other hand, in many cases, it's hard to miss.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to try that in front of my music teacher and we'll see what she says. The next question is there nothing common between beauty, as in beauty of artwork, like in pieces of music, theater, poetry, painting, etc., and beauty of a sunflower, you know, sunset, flower, so on and so forth? Yeah. Are we restless seeing a beautiful flower or sunrise, a sunrise dawn experience? And this is from Arindam, who you predicted was in the audience. And this is the Atharva Veda. He's quoting Atharva Veda here. Pashya Devasya Kavyam, look at the poetry of the gods. It does not die, it does not grow old. Yeah. So why do we call King Lear, Hamsadvani, and the sunrise and moonlight, all of this beautiful? Okay. Actually, of course, there's a lot in common. I'm not saying that there's everything in common. It's, of course, the case that a great artist who is some kind of individual is offering us something on the basis of his or her experience. And that might be a little different. I mean, it should be a little different from looking at a fantastic sunset, you know. But, you know, I can say about myself, I don't know about everybody, but I can certainly say for myself that if I am in an overwhelmingly beautiful landscape, as I was, for example, 2 days ago in the Jordan Valley, as I go out there to be with the Palestinian shepherds and to try to protect them from the violence of Israeli settlers, you know, we're out in the desert. It's unbelievably beautiful. And I have the same sense, absolutely the same sense of restlessness. I'm afraid to close my eyes because I won't be able to remember what I'm seeing. There's an element of anxiety, and there's an element of, I think of pariyutsukatva, of some kind of longing, which is not focused on a definable object, but is very much there and seems to be part and parcel of the experience of beauty. So actually, I think the commonality between the work of a great artist and the work of the gods is very strong. Having said that, I also want to say that there are artists who have a kind of predilection, a preference for vivaldi effects. And in my experience, this is me, you don't have to agree with me, but in my experience, I think that Muthuswami Dikshitar is the great master of vivaldi effects. I've given you just two very minor examples, but if we had time, we could spend several hours listening to Dikshitar and you'd see it very often. And he learned this, I think. Well, maybe it was just natural in him. I don't know. It's possible. But I think he learned it from his elder contemporary, Shyama Shastri, who is also amazingly given, it's much smaller repertoire, of course, but given to these vivaldi effects. You know, I'll tell you something. It's something that it speaks to what I was trying to say earlier about relying on one's own taste. You know, when T.M. Krishna was here in Jerusalem, it was about 2 years ago, he gave a series of concerts. The big concert, the main one, he began with this amazing kirtana of Shyama Shastri in Todi Raga. Todi Raga is not a vivaldi raga. Todi Raga is a very heavy raga, maybe the ultimately heavy raga, which usually you get in a Carnatic kacheri somewhere in the middle or even towards the end of a concert. You have to kind of work your way up or down into the magnificence of Todi. But Todi, depends how you sing it, Todi can sound very dissonant. And I can tell you, you know, he had the courage to begin with this kirtana, which is a well-known one, Nimmi Namminanu. It's a fantastic kirtana, but he began with it.
And the audience was filled with people who came to hear classical Carnatic music, but several of them couldn't stand the dissonance and got up and left. And that's even before we begin to identify where the vivaditva might possibly be located or not.
Thank you. The next question is actually tied back to the first question. Is there something like good dissonance and bad dissonance? If yes, must one view the presence of the former through the prism of helpless incorrigibility, or within the larger system of control and tonal violence that the practice of music itself might be said to embody?
Okay. I mean, that's another fascinating question. And I want to say two things. First of all, I have to say that I have a horror of typologies. I don't like typologies, but I'm prepared to address this question because it's important. If you think in Western music, those of you who know Western music, if you think of Stravinsky, it's a raucous. It's not simply dissonant. It's actually often very raucous. I happen to like Stravinsky. When I was a young boy, I was a violinist. That was the sort of core of my life in a way. And I used to listen to music every night as I was falling asleep. And my brother and I shared a room. And I would often put on Stravinsky. I tortured my brother night after night by making him listen to The Rite of Spring, which is raucous, So now what does that mean? Am I going to call that bad dissonance? Actually, it's rather beautiful. I think it's rather beautiful. But you can imagine a kind of highly modern 20th century aesthetic mode in which dissonance is so overwhelming that it leaves you with nothing but misery. So that would perhaps be a kind of bad dissonance. But I do want to say that if we're even going to begin to think in these terms, then we have to begin to elaborate a kind of inductive theory in which there's room for these different forms, and there's an element here of taste. And it's taste which is not necessarily dependent upon the standard conventional norms that we find in the tradition. It is more dependent upon what we hear with our own ears.
And the next question is actually about taste. So I think that would be a nice segue. You said that the possibility of having a cognitive experience in which there is no object at all is that.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could you say that again?
The experience of beauty is that cognitive experience in which there is no object at all. So
Yes.
The question is, by what pramana can we perceive this prameya? And are these cognitive states self-revealing in nature, or do we need another cognitive state to reveal themselves to the spectator or the listener? So in other words, in a very simplified version, how do we develop these states?
Yeah.
Or is there anything like that?
Actually, if we're talking about the drama, I suppose the pramana would be pratyakshatva. I suppose it's something that you can see. It's not something that that is actually hidden from you. In fact, it should be in some sense present. That's what Abhinavagupta seems to be saying. Now there are other levels where the pramana is of some other order, anubhuti, one might say, very but it is something that you would know possibly from bodily experience. So it may not necessarily be a purely mentalistic mode. In fact, I don't think it's purely mentalistic. I don't think so. As to the question of whether one might need a second order cognition in order to understand that. So, the Nyaya position is that every cognition requires a second order cognition. I mean, I might know something, but I won't know that I know it unless there's that second order cognition, And actually, I believe that that's true to human experience. I think the Nyaya insight is a very meaningful one. So you could go that way. You could follow the Nyaya mode. That's one kind of epistemic stance. But I think it's also possible to imagine, at least, that you would know without fully knowing exactly what has happened to you. You might know in a way that is sitting, you might feel it in your stomach or in your heart or in the pores of your skin or in the neurons, I don't know. You might actually feel it in such a way. And how you know it, you might know it after the fact, because if Abhinavagupta is right, but I don't think he's right, but if he were right, then you would have that experience. You would have that experience of this kind of true rasanubhava, which he says is Brahmananda sa Brahmachari. It's somehow akin in a transient way. It's a kind of co-student of the Brahmananda. You might actually have that. That might be an indication. That's what Danielle, my student, was saying. An indication that that cognitive dissonance was lying in place somewhere before you actually reach that moment.
I think we have time for two more questions, so we'll take both of them. The first one is, what role does timbre play in this theory of beauty? Timbre.
Timbre?
Timbre. And no note, dissonant or not, can be heard separately from the tone of the voice of the singer singing it, or the way an instrument is played by a musician. So what role does timbre play?
Yeah. Timbre has got to be part of the whole entire setup in which you're going to have let us call it the Vadi Sambadi notes, if you want to use that terminology, and also the Vivadi notes. It's got to be part of the whole thing. Of course, timbre is there. I prefer to talk about texture, which is a slightly wider term. But timbre, and I know exactly, I can understand where this question is coming. Timbre has got to be an element in this. And that's why, sometimes, after all, their voices, we hear musicians who have voices that are kind of gruff and ostensibly not very melodious or lyrical, and we like it in some cases. I mean, it's a personal thing. Some people really like it. There's another element which is involved in that. It's connected to timbre, and that's the existence of resonances and overtones that are present, even though you're not actually hearing them outright. That is also, so you could see, if we were to pursue this line of thought, I've made only a kind of introductory statement. If we were to pursue it, we would want to actually map out the whole world that goes into the, what shall we call it? The production, but also the reception of an artistic masterpiece.
Last question, and this is a kind of, I think, a very important question. It has to do with the politics of beauty itself. So the question is beauty necessary as a concept? After all, by categorizing something as beautiful, aren't we setting some kind of expectations and standards for the future, whether it is dissonance or not, and thereby restricting our range of appreciation? But I think, this is the question. I also think, on the other hand, the way in which you're theorizing beauty right now is much more sustainable in that sense. So I want you to comment on this question.
So I think that beauty is a given part of the world, and it is something that we experience. If you detach beauty from normativity, and if you free yourself from the notion that there are canonical forms of beauty that one has to adhere to in order to achieve some kind of theoretical beauty, which the canon or the tradition or whatever tells us is what we need. If you detach yourself from that and just allow yourself to feel and see beauty when you see it, whatever it might be, then I think it's very difficult to deny it. It's a little bit like love. I was reading an amazing song, hearing a song by Bob Dylan just 2 or 3 nights ago, in which he talks about love. He says, listen to this. It's an interesting analogy. He says that I'm in love with this woman. She's ugly. She's not beautiful. Her teeth are crooked and her face, but I love her. And there's no particular reason. I can't explain why I love her. There's no cause to it. There's no causality, no perceptible cause, but I love her. You could possibly apply a canon like that, namely some spontaneous, internal, perceptive, receptive act in which beauty appears. It becomes manifest, which is actually quite close in a way to the classical aesthetic theories as well.
There are actually some very fascinating questions, but we are out of time.
Yeah.
There's a question about samvega and existential aesthetics in relation to dissonance. So if you can briefly comment on that, then we'll do it. Otherwise, we'll end the session.
All right. So yeah, I see from the note, samvega. That's right. I mean, we have, put it like this, the tradition has plenty of materials to offer us if we want to listen to them and look for them. So it's quite right. There is a strand of the classical tradition, and certainly of the medieval, late medieval, early modern traditions, certainly, where the idea is that the experience of beauty should shock you. Actually, there's a beautiful Telugu poem by Nanni Choda. He says, if you hear a poem, and if you know, it's like an archer shooting an arrow into your heart. If the poem doesn't go deep into your heart and pierce you like that arrow, then it's no arrow and it's no poem. So, you know, that's the kind of statement. I could actually give you another dozen like that, in which some sense of this unsettling, the necessary unsettling, destructive quality of a great poem, a great piece of music, a painting, a theatrical performance, a dance, all of these have something central which may or may not actually jiggle you up. And I would go so far as to say that in the practice of the various artistic domains in the early modern period in the South, at least, that direction is probably more evident than the notion of a kind of vishranti, kind of peaceful wholeness and fullness. Probably it's more in evidence.
Thank you, David. This was an illuminating, beautiful, and illustrative session. Thank you very much for giving a wonderful start to our Milan series. And thank you all for joining us on a Sunday night. The next session is on Saturday at 6:30, and you'll all receive an invite for it too. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you.